All right, so I'm here with a very young, interesting lady. Uh, you might want to introduce yourself to the viewers who don't know you, maybe. So,
Yeah, I'm sure your viewers
yeah.
won't know me, but hi, I'm Ileana Chan. I am the producer and director at Empire Watch. I guess we would call me the producer and director, but I have like two shows on Empire Watch. It's a YouTube channel called Global Majority for Peace, and also a weekly live called Global South Rising.
All right. Today we are going to talk about a very interesting question of which not much is known, but is always running somewhere in our lives, especially also in Asia, but also in other countries or continents like Africa and also America. And that topic is imperialism. And it seems to me that you know a lot about it. So we wanted to talk about some imperialism, how it is in Asia, um,
Mhm.
the effects of imperialism. A lot of times, then I hear people say, "But we don't own colonies there anymore. So why are they complaining?" Could you maybe enlighten us that maybe the effects of all that imperialism is still actually very much going on in the lives of the people that still live there?
Yeah, okay. So I think this is a really interesting question because you're so right to say that there's so much confusion around the term imperialism. People don't understand that we're still living in a world that is very much ruled by imperialism, and it's purposeful. There's a reason why we're so confused. There's a reason why it's obscured, and I think. First of all, to sort of define what imperialism is, I
Yeah.
would say, and I would just caveat this by saying I'm not an academic in this region. I'm not a historian or academic. I started my podcast Empire Watch because I realized this misunderstanding about imperialism. And I initially started my YouTube channel with the co-founder of No Cold War. It's a campaign against the new Cold War, or really the continuing Cold War that we're currently having. And we can sort of look at the Cold War as this the fight between imperialism and communism or socialism. You can kind of see the Cold War in through that lens, and it's still sort of ongoing till now. It's just that imperialism won so well, it basically won that the divisions became a little bit less clear as socialism or communism seemed to decline. So it sort of like disappeared in many people's consciousness. But now that's sort of changing with the rise of China. So it's a really interesting time that we're having. But basically, so the way that I like to think of imperialism in a very, very simple way is if we think about it as the highest stage of capitalism, and I like to think of it as what is the goal of capitalism, and therefore what is the goal of imperialism. So capitalism, the goal of capitalism is the continual accumulation of wealth. Like the you have to accumulate more and more capital. That's like the main goal of capitalism. So the metrics of success is just more and more and more accumulation of capital. It requires a growth aspect of the continuation accumulation of capital. And therefore, it sort of makes sense that imperialism happens because that would be the natural progression from accumulating more and more capital. You have to sort of expand out of the borders of your country. And I would say too, that's accumulation for capital for a very select amount of people. Because if the only metrics for success is more and more capital, then inevitably it's at the expense of the people around you. It's the expense of the periphery. It's the expense of the world. But that group of capitalists, the capitalist class, gets smaller and smaller and smaller just through the driving force of the logic of capitalism. So imperialism is the inevitable outgrowth of capitalism. I kind of think of it that way. And then, well, that's the goal of imperialism, right? And then really imperialism or capitalism is the system that allows that accumulation, a continual accumulation of wealth to happen. And that's where it gets really confusing and complicated because and the how is so complicated because it's like really capitalism or imperialism is a completely irrational ideology. It's like completely irrational to think that a small group of people should hoard more and more wealth at the expense of the vast majority of the rest of the world. Like, so I think that because it's such an unnatural state, the system that keeps it in place requires so much coercive control. So it requires things like military, it requires financial control, it requires political control, it requires all sorts of different mechanisms to keep that system in place. So that's where it gets very, very confusing. But I think if we think of it kind of like in that way as to what the driving force of imperialism is, then everything that comes out of that gets a little bit clearer. I don't know if I'm making it more clear. I don't know if I'm making it clearer. Because
Well, uh,
obviously,
for the people who don't understand certain things, I think it's also important to show to the people why it is that the group of people is getting smaller and smaller. And I think that is because they monopolize everything, right?
well, yeah, I mean,
They
monopolies are just
monopolize entire markets so others cannot get in. That is why the
exactly.
group is getting smaller and smaller. And that is why the burden is going to be carried by more and more people.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like every single strategy to make sure that the smaller group of people that have the most money just get more and more money. So monopolies are um, a natural response to that. But yeah, but you know, um, regime change. I mean, everything would sort of go into that. Like, we just have to think about all the creative ways in which an unnatural system will continue to sustain. And that's basically what we've got with imperialism.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Do you think how do you think imperialism is still going on?
Well, yes, obviously, because of that driving force of capitalism and imperialism. Therefore, sort of thinking about the logic of that, what would be the way in which we could actually stop imperialism is it's not as simple as just saying no. Because in that example that sort of like explanation that I gave, you would just think that we would just say no to this very unfair project. But because of the coercion and the control, it's not so easy. So I guess if we would think about it like, imperialism being the ideology, but then all these different stages like colonialism, neocolonialism, super imperialism, hyper imperialism, all these different stages are basically the attempt to describe the system as it exists in whatever time period that we're in.
Yeah.
So, to actually defeat imperialism, but to make it very simple, well, and not make it very simple, but let's think about where we are today. To actually defeat imperialism today, we would have to dismantle, and I kind of think of this in like three basic pillars of imperialism: military, economics, like financial aspect of it, and then propaganda. We would have to dismantle all those three in order to completely dismantle imperialism. But those three pillars are what upholds the imperialist system. And we can define the imperialist system today as US led. It's a US imperial bloc. It's a US led imperial bloc of um, of the global north, which is 49 countries. So you can kind of look at that as the imperialist system that controls the world today. I mean, and at least this is sort of put forth, this is put forth by the Tricontinental Research Institute's Hyper-Imperialism, a dangerous decadent new stage. And they are trying to define within that dossier, which is a pretty good read, I think, what US imperialism looks like today. It's US led, but go ahead. Did you have a question?
I hear a lot of times that people say it's you say it actually a little bit more properly. Most of the people say, yeah, it is the United States imperialism. But if we look at the United States, does the government have really anything to say? I mean, aren't they just the puppets of that very small group?
Yeah, I mean, but you have to think of it as that is the system that they have. They have put
Yeah,
forth this system, that country has that system. And in that system, the capitalist class controls the state. It's actually required because if we think again about the driving force of capitalism and imperialism, they need to accumulate power to accumulate capital. And you absolutely have to do it via the control of state because then you have the control of military, you have the control of financial markets, you have the control of all these propaganda, you know what I mean? Like, so obviously you're going to be accruing power by controlling the state. That would be what a capitalist country is. So yes, to like answer the question that I think is really comes up a lot here is that, yeah, the US is accountable for this. This is the
yeah,
system that they've put forth. They are responsible for this system. You don't, and I think the thing about the global north, like when we're in the global north, is we've been brainwashed to think that there is no possible other system. So we
yeah,
have this type of thing where it's like, no, it's not the American people. It's not and we don't understand that that is just absolutely disempowering for the American people to just be like, oh, you can change the system. Like that is the entire point of recognizing what the US imperialist system is. We have to understand the levers of control within that system. We have to understand what it looks like now and that it can change. So even this hyper-imperialism document that I mentioned, it was written in 2023 after like a year of like research and discussion amongst like around 100 authors. But they're describing how they're viewing the US imperialist system in that moment, which means it's not in 5 years and 10 years, that might not be what the US imperialist system looks like, you know? So I think like, yeah, so, okay, go on. Sorry, go
no,
ahead.
no. Can you name a couple of examples so that people can have something tangible, like what kind of tools they are using,
Yeah,
like maybe institutions or because we talk a lot about imperialism, but for a
go
lot of
ahead.
people, it is really still not clear. Like they cannot put their
Yeah.
finger on it. They think certain institutions are actually helping, but they're not.
Right,
And,
yeah.
and
So
so maybe we can dive into that so how the people can see it, right?
yeah, that's a really good point. I know. It's hard to it's hard to believe when you don't believe in it. Okay, so first of all, if we think about the US imperialist bloc, like I was just talking about, the 49 countries in the global north, and then we think about like the US in the inner core. This is the way the Tricontinental Research dossier defines the global north. They define it in concentric rings. So the inner core of US imperialism, or this US led imperial bloc, is the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel. It's essentially the Five Eyes with Israel being an added component because really Israel is an unofficial part of the Five Eyes because of their special relationship with the US, right? So I mean, so in terms of that, you can already see the inner core, apart from having all this relationship with political relationship, economic relationship, military relationship, also has intelligence sharing relationship. So that's what is sort of like defined as the inner core of the global north. And then the second ring has the EU countries essentially. But or like the top Italy, France, the top sort of EU countries within that. But what we have to kind of think about is how are all these concentric rings, how are they connected? And they're connected through, like I said, financial institutions. They're connected through things like NATO. So when I'm talking about those three pillars of coercion, the military bloc is, yeah, the military industrial complex. Sure, but it's also the military bases all around the world. It is also NATO as a war alliance, AUKUS, JAUKUS, all those war alliances, and also the physical military installations. So the US has 902 US military bases all around the world. And it, for example, has like tens of thousands of US troops stationed all around the world in different parts of the world. So that already will show the links between these countries and the US. And how it's not so easy, therefore, to just say like no to the US, right? There's going to be coercive powers now, which make you part of that bloc. And I think the key thing with this tricontinental dossier, though, is that they do the 49 countries in the global north. They're really trying to define those countries that are more than just. It's not just that they have military bases in those countries. It's also that they greatly benefit from that system. And they also have a history of colonization and imperialism. So that's why they're defined as the 49 countries in the global north. Japan is in that global north category, for example, which
Yeah.
people might not realize.
But they all have the same nature, right? Would it be because it's grown out of the same groups of people?
I mean, I don't think that is necessarily. I mean, yeah, at some points, but I don't think so. I think prior to World War II, you might have different imperialist camps because you had Japan on one side, you had the US and UK on the other side. But essentially, after World War II, you had the US emerging as a preeminent superpower, um, decolonization happening, and sort of a folding in from these people, the British Empire, etc., sort of folding into US imperialism as their power waned as colonial powers. They're not going to give up their power. So they just sort of figure out different ways to continue to accumulate their capital.
It's
Which is,
interesting that you mentioned decolonization,
yeah,
but there's still a form of colonization going on, right? Well, at least my country still has physical colonies. uh,
right.
Neocolonization, it is another form of colonization, right? Could you
Yeah.
explain that?
Okay, so I think it's what is really important to understand
That
here
that
is
that is
that,
what Western people really don't get. Often
right.
I tell them, well, we are still colonizing other nations. What do you mean?
Yeah, I think it's important to think of colonization, colonialism. It's just, it's a strategy of imperialism. So imperialism still exists. Colonialism would have been the physical settlements, the direct foreign control, the direct political control of these countries. As that period after World War II, it was an I think it was an optimistic period as they kicked out a lot of the foreign forces, right? The British kicked out, etc. And then we can sort of look at the Bandung Conference in 1955 as this declaration of we have gotten rid of the colonial powers, and now as sovereign countries, we can um, determine our own path. We are, it's a declaration of intent to be independent from these powers. But like I was saying before, the engine of capitalism, the engine of this type of greed and entitlement, which is what capitalism engenders, they're not just going to give up their power. Like they were kicked out, but they're still going to figure out a way to continue to accumulate their capital. And so that's what we can sort of think of as neocolonialism, because neocolonialism really sort of coined by the Ghanaian president, the first Ghanaian president, Kwame Nkrumah, in his book Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Um, he, I think he was responding to this 1955 Bandung movement, where they really did believe on one hand that they had gotten rid of colonialism. So he was kind of warning of the other ways in which these former colonial countries are still going to try to exert their power. And so they exert their power in economic dominance and political manipulation, in divide and conquer, in like regime change operations and propaganda. And that is what we are seeing now to this day is imperialism. So neocolonialism is very much the mechanisms, and it's trying to clarify the structures of coercion that are still ongoing today. And it's, I mean, yeah. So to your point, yes, obviously it's ongoing. Colonialism is just a specific type of imperialism, but we haven't gotten rid of imperialism completely, for
All
sure.
right. Um, do you maybe know something about what imperialism was in China and how they
Yeah,
got rid of it?
I mean, I think that yeah, this is where I think the Cold War framing is really important, because socialism is the oppositional force to imperialism. And again, it's because we're positioning imperialism, we're recognizing that imperialism is the natural growth of capitalism, the expansion for more capital. Socialism is counter to that. It's for China, it's common. I think the easiest way to think about it actually is the way that China positions it, which is common prosperity for all. Um, and that is counter to capitalism. Absolutely counter it. It requires protection of the people from capitalism, and that sort of explains why um, China is seen as such a great threat to Western powers and to imperialist powers. But yeah, the century of humiliation is probably what you're talking about. The Opium War, that sort of time where there was specific, China wasn't completely colonized, but there were specific areas that they were colonized. I mean, famously, Qingdao, the beer was actually
Yeah,
the town that was colonized by Germany, and hence like the Heineken beer that is now
that is
famous.
that's actually what triggered the Boxers' Rebellion. The
Right. Okay.
Germans, yes, because they were so forcefully trying to colonize it that it was so unbearable for the people that they started a Boxer Rebellion in the area where the Germans were trying to colonize. Yeah, they were
Wow.
ruthless. They seemed to be ruthless. Yeah, that
That's
is why the
crazy.
Boxers Rebellion started.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm not a
and
historian, as I said.
and then on top of that, the Chinese were called barbarians
Hmm.
by the Brits. I'm not sure if the Germans also called them barbarians, but literally in the British newspapers from those times, the Chinese were called barbarians because they started to defend themselves against the plundering of their land.
That's very much what's happening
Yeah.
today. I mean, we can see that sort of,
I was about, yeah, that is indeed what we see today, right? Everywhere
yeah,
where we attack, they are the bad guys. We are never the bad guys.
exactly. We're
We
never the
had
bad
to
guys.
do it, but they haven't done anything yet. But it's preemptive.
Exactly.
Otherwise, they would do it to us, right? I
Yeah,
hear that a lot. China
yeah,
needs to do this because that's just how it is. No, they're not. They're socialists. They're not. They're not capitalists, right? So the way of thinking is totally different.
yeah. Absolutely. It's socialist when it's failing, and it's capitalist when it's succeeding.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Essentially.
What is it actually that you think that is most misunderstanding for people about imperialism?
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, that it exists. I think like you're pointing out in this that a lot of people don't understand that it exists. Um, and essentially it's part of the propaganda of it is that it's the only system. It strangely enough, it's kind of like it doesn't actually exist because the system that we're in is the only system that could possibly be, you know? And I think that's probably the biggest misconception about it because therefore, even people who are so-called proclaimed Western leftists will then go, I'm anti-imperialist, but China's also imperialist. Russia's also imperialist. Um, and that sort of thinking, first of all, makes it so that imperialism, they take away just how horrific imperialism is. Because if you look at what China has done, which most of it is made up, as you know, as you rightly know, like so much of it is made up about what China has supposedly done. But anyway, the accusations against China are mainly about what they've done to their own people, which is again made up, like the Uyghur
Yeah.
genocide, completely made up. But they're doing it to their own people. And sort of within that, false narrative about what China has done to their own people, they're completely negating the tens and tens, like the hundreds of millions of people that have been killed in the name of imperialism, Western
Yeah.
imperialism.
Yeah. For
So,
the Opium War, about 160 million people in India had to die to
yeah, I mean,
produce that opium, right? They destroyed the entire cotton industry of Canada because opium was more important, so they could poison the Chinese people to make more money. It's
exactly.
it's it's so ridiculous. So
And we
um,
can also look at the slave trade as that is
yeah.
genocidal, absolutely. Genocide is definitely a feature of imperialism. It's not a bug at all. And so,
So
you know,
but for today, a lot of people also accuse China of being imperialist because they invest in Africa and they see the same. But they're doing exactly the same as us. That's what they say. Well, everybody knows I live in the Netherlands, so when I say us, uh,
right.
uh, but how is it different than that other institutions are doing it? Because China is also lending money to Africa, and how does it differ with imperialism?
I mean,
From
it completely differs. And I mean, we have so many examples of it, but I think really to sort of boil it down to what is in the US imperialism's, and that, like I just clarified before, US imperialism doesn't just, it's not just about US, right? It's the 49 global North countries. It's this entire system of US imperialism, the imperialist, Western imperialist bloc. What is in their supposed interests? Knowing their goal is just the accumulation of more and more profit, more and more capital. That's really it, and more power because of it. They
but
don't
not for the
care,
country, right?
not for
For
the country,
what
for
we
a
call the one
select,
percent or the elite.
yeah, for
Yeah.
a select group of the capital class.
Yeah, I think
No,
that is also important to highlight a lot because if you don't know what you're up against, right? We can say the Netherlands. Yeah, the Netherlands is definitely busy in very busy in imperialist activities, as is the United States. But then again, our governments are not our real governments. They just there for a show, like you go to the Muppet Show to watch. Yeah, I don't know if anybody knows it, but that was in my time the show.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah, so yeah, I always want to make it a point so people really, really understand what they are up against, right? Because it is actually a really, really small group of people.
Yeah,
And it is very hard to believe that 8 billion people could not get out of the spell or the claws of these just very small
exactly.
group of people.
Yeah,
Extremely small, right?
exactly. That's why we
Uh,
really have to identify their
yeah,
powers of coercion because, um, yeah, because like we're talking about in Africa, just say, we have to really think about their levels of power, and we can look at it in terms of what I just sort of laid out. The military presence in Africa is absolutely imperative for their extraction of wealth. They don't care about anything else but the continual extraction of wealth from Africa. So it actually requires an underdevelopment of Africa, right? Or the continent of Africa. It requires an underdevelopment. It is better if these countries are weak for the Western imperialism because it's easier to keep just extracting the raw materials and giving nothing back. The profit margin will be so much more if we just extract, don't give anything back to them. That's obviously the biggest profit margin. So everything we do is in service to that. Like that's the in the supposed interest of these capitalist class people. Whereas China has a completely different model. Their model is not about just extraction of wealth. They are looking at, they really do believe, and it makes sense for them to believe in the rising water, the rising tide lifts all boats. It actually makes sense for them, and it makes sense for them within their borders. That is how the lifting out of poverty. That's why, the 850 million people that they lifted out of poverty. That is actually why they're such a huge power in this day. They also have an ideological difference. Because of socialism, it's common prosperity for all. It's not common prosperity for a few. And in that system that they've already set up, it does not serve their interests if everyone around them is extremely underdeveloped and poor. Because part of their whole mechanism is the market, is producing something and selling it to people. In a completely different way from in which the Western imperialist countries have set up their economy, which is more financialization and debt, and because that's like the easiest quick buck that they'll get. So I mean, if we even look at the interests of both these, the US versus, or the West versus China, you can just see already that China just does not benefit from just like underdevelopment and extraction, continual extraction. Now, does that mean that there's like absolute, like, because I get accused of this a lot. Oh, you're saying China's perfect. And like, obviously, we're not saying China's perfect, but we're just saying that what happens in that paradigm is that, these countries, and they're in different levels of sovereignty is the other thing that we have to really realize. Different levels of capture, but countries are allowed to negotiate in the terms that China sets for them because it is more of an equal partnership. It's like it's a win-win corporation. You do need a win-win situation in that paradigm with China, which you absolutely cannot get in the US because a win-win situation with the West would be to get rid of the Western forces in Africa. I mean, that's clearly obvious. So it's very different. And then also that's just one part of it, which is like the practical, getting down to the weeds sort of thing of the difference between China and the West. But also the other thing, like we talked about, is China isn't in that global North bloc, that US imperialism global North bloc either. So it can't. One, it doesn't have those three levers of coercion that I'm talking about. It doesn't have the military installations. It doesn't have the propaganda, like the billions and billions and billions or trillions maybe of money they spend on propaganda. And it doesn't have these financialized institutions all over the world. So it can't even use those levers of control anyway. So you know what I mean? Like, so already you can see the immense difference that you would have between dealing with China and dealing with the West.
Yeah. Also, when you borrow money from the IMF, then they will come in and dictate to you how you need to do economically wise, your economic policies. And if you cannot pay back, then it will be sold to the Paris Club, who also will do the same, dictate to you how you need to structure your economy. And I mean, we don't have to tell anybody the economies of Africa mainly are still not really that good. So the policies that they are forced to put in place most likely aren't good either, right?
Yeah, I mean,
So I
those,
think that's a big difference between China and the West, because China just doesn't care how you structure your economy. That's for you, and they only give you money for projects that will yield some money back, so you can pay it back. While IMF often is just borrowing money to you, so you can give it to somebody else that you own money to.
yeah, I mean, we have to, IMF and World Bank are part of the coercive pillar of financialization for the West, like
Yeah,
for Western imperialism, for sure. I mean, they're not gonna just, they have no interest in your development. So why would they be giving you money to for your own good? You know what I mean? Those are levers of control over you, and
yeah,
they can take away the loan if you decide to go up against them or not. Um, but I do think that with yeah, I think you made a really good point with China not caring. It's not that they don't care, it's that they have a very strong ideological belief that in the non-interference.
yeah.
Because, like we talked about the 1955 Bandung Conference,
That
which,
is what I meant with not care. I mean, I
yeah,
didn't mean
yeah.
like I we don't care how your
Yeah.
economy is, but they just believe in not interfering in other people's
Yeah.
internal affairs or other countries' internal affairs. That
They believe in
sorry,
not
just
interfering.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. They believe in the non-interfering thing. And I think they're very much aligned with the Bandung spirit of the non-alignment movements. It's just the only problem with the non-alignment movement that was founded like in the 60s is that the US imperialism will not allow you to be non-aligned. That's the problem with it. China actually would much prefer you to be able to be sovereign and non-aligned because it would actually benefit themselves and benefit all of the global South. So I think, yeah, it's not, I don't think it's, yeah, I know you didn't mean it this way, but it's not about them not caring. It's just them understanding, one, non-alignment really needs to be the way forward, but US imperialism doesn't allow non-alignment. But how do you actually combat that anyway? If China was trying to combat US imperialism by interfering in these, like, how would that even work, considering the levers of power are so powerful? Like, it's not even realistic, for them to interfere. So there's that element of, yes, it's ideologically consistent for them to be like, we believe that every country should be sovereign and determine their own path. But two, pragmatically impossible for them to even do anything about it.
yeah. China is definitely not capable.
Imperialists. Yeah.
It's
And
not
they,
capable because because especially now you see it with Iran, you see a lot of people. Well, China should help them militarily. They can't. They cannot even when they want to because 80% of their military is based upon defensive model, not on offensive. It's only
yeah.
20% that's offensive, right? So it's not like the United States that they can ship a whole ton of people or military installations all the way to Iran or to other places in the world to protect other nations. It's just impossible. They simply don't have it.
Yeah, they don't have it. They haven't
Yeah.
invested in that type of infrastructure. And also, like, it wouldn't really solve anything. It would escalate everything into World War III,
Yeah,
is the other thing.
exactly. But not only that, I think that people should also not want it because
Exactly.
it will open the door to
Yeah.
create another imperialistic power. Okay, so maybe it can defeat the United States and the Western imperialists, but now you will be stuck with Chinese imperialism. That's just
It's
crazy,
just
right?
not real, and it's
Because
not
you open the
reality.
door for it, right?
Well, it's not, yeah, it's not even opening the door, right? Because in order for them to do that, you're right, in that they would already have to be acting like an imperialist all the way through in
Yeah,
order to do that.
yeah, because that's
So,
what a lot of people say. They need to get into Iran because they also very much dependent on the oil. Well, if they're going to interfere, then exactly that is imperialism. Why wouldn't they overthrow the government and just take it all for themselves? Problem solved,
yeah,
right?
it's
Just
ridiculous.
not have that problem. We just overthrow it ourselves and take it. See if the
Take it.
United States still wants to mingle in it, right?
And I think it really proves the mettle of China, how China is very, very consistent, even
Yeah,
though, and I think you know this, and I hope to invite you on my show and actually ask you more about these things, but you know this more than most people, right? That China is very, very adaptive. They're so adaptive to their people, they're adaptive trial and error. That's how they figure out their policies. But in terms of consistent
yeah.
ideology,
They
they're
don't
very
understand.
consistent.
Yeah, they don't understand the word no. I mean, in a good way, right? I give a little story about why I say that. There's a huge stairs in Beijing in the Forbidden Palace, right? A slab of stone with a carved-in dragon or whatever it is. It is not from Beijing. It comes from a way, way out of Beijing. I forgot the name of the place. But they had to bring it there a couple hundred years ago. And the emperor did not allow it to be brought in pieces. It must be brought in one piece.
Oh
That's
no.
almost impossible because it weighs tons. So they would transport only in the winter, and they would just throw a little bit water on a certain place and wait for it to freeze so they can just pull it over the water, over the frozen water, right? And with ice. And this is how they proceed. This is the mindset of the Chinese people. There's nobody who would say that's impossible to do. Just think of how they think about it, how they adapt to every situation, like you say, right? It's like, oh yeah, oh, we need to do it. Okay, we just figure out a way. And that is also why a lot of people say, yeah, but if they're not, and if they're not interfering in Iran, they will go totally. Well, I think they already anticipated on it and already think about other ways to get energy, right?
Yeah, they do. They have, they're definitely the number one green energy providers and investors. But I think it's also incorrect to say they're not doing anything about Iran. Like they are completely understanding of the situation.
Yeah, the difference is they don't speak.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I think the only country right now that really would benefit from announcing their plans bombastically is the US because they need to scare you. And they're actually trying to cover for the fact that their military power is actually diminishing in many ways. So they're outwardly going around telling everybody what their supposed intents are, right?
yeah,
But China's not going to do that. It doesn't benefit China or Iran is very intelligent in the way that um, they pose their official statements. So often when we see Iran will say something about China and then China won't. And you can kind of think, well, maybe it's somewhere in the middle. But there's a lot of Iranian official statements that come out talking about Chinese cooperation. And maybe they're also doing that to sort of warn against the US. So,
yeah.
anything that's officially stated, we can just take as strategy, war strategy, psychological war strategy. And China's just very not really engaging in that.
Yeah, China, I think it's also because of the system that they have. They don't need the propaganda, right? They
Yeah,
just
they
show
have
the
a
people that,
different,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, like, it's like Deng Xiaoping said, uh, poverty isn't socialism. Development is the hard truth. It's a famous quote from 1992. And that's it. That's really been their strategy. They're going to show you the hard truth of why their system is better, not through
yeah,
persuading you by words, but allowing you to come to the country and to witness it for yourself. So, yeah.
yeah. Um, so a lot of people say that imperialism is a bit overused. How the word,
Yeah.
how would you respond to that?
I mean, I understand what they're saying, but actually, I think this is just a form of propaganda in terms of everything that we talk about, like any intellectual discourse that we have, essentially gets co-opted by propaganda, US imperialist propaganda, and then overused until the meaning disappears from it. Like people don't really understand the meaning of the word imperialist or meaning of the word racism or all these things. But actually imperialism isn't used at all when it comes to mainstream media. Actually, it is not used in a genuine way, not in the definition that it's used. And I think that just shows you actually what the root cause is, because they actually don't want us to know about imperialism. If you watch any mainstream news coverage on any current affairs, there's no there's no reference to imperialism. There's no acknowledgement that the UK and the US are part of an imperialist system. There's no acknowledgement in all of that. The only times they use the word imperialism or imperialist might be to talk about Russia, which is, as we've
Or
discussed,
China.
or China, yeah. And as we've discussed, those are not the imperialist powers in our world at all. So actually, it's underused in terms of the definition of the actual definition of the word, and purposefully because they really don't want us to understand that we're part of an imperialist system. They really want us to think that it's just like random countries acting up. Like, why is Russia suddenly acting up? Like, they kind of want to do, even now, I think, in terms of the rhetoric around Trump, a rhetoric around what the US is doing, there's an emphasis on calling the US a rogue state, Trump is an anomaly, etc. Versus these are escalations of an imperialist system that's
Yeah.
we've been living under for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I think that people need to understand first, okay, if it is a rogue state, why is it a rogue state? Right?
Yeah,
Or it's behaving in a certain way. Why is it behaving in a certain way? Right? As I think I always tell the people that they need to think like that little kid, always asking why, until you have no more answers.
right.
There's actually a skit of Louis C.K. that there's his little daughter is asking him why all the time. Every answer that he gives is why, right? And it goes all the back to all the way to her existence, like why? And yeah, because your dad bumped into your mother and they fell in love. Why? Well, they did something in the bed, right? Why? And then all of a sudden, in the end, he said, because God wanted. Oh, okay. But I mean, ask yourself why, right? So why is the United States acting as a rogue system? It doesn't have to, because it is clear and evident that the Americans themselves, most of them, do not benefit from it,
Well, I
right?
think that, yeah, definitely, like we're saying in capitalism, the majority of the 99.9% of people don't benefit from it genuinely. Although there is a certain complicity within even the working class of the global north, or imperialist countries historically have benefited from the extraction from the global south.
Yeah,
Now we're sort of seeing in the implosion of really the last, maybe this is optimistic, but I think we're just seeing the last stages of this US imperialist system, the US empire. Um, Now you're seeing that everybody within that system is like cannibalizing itself at this moment. It's just exhausted its abilities, because it's just the trajectory has gotten to its inevitable like decline, right? That's kind of one of the ways to look at it. But I think, to your question of, people keep saying this to me, why is the US acting like this? Why is Trump acting like this? And really, I think they're not able to accept their decline, though. So it's almost like, because of their very nature, they do require this trajectory of trying to come back to the unipolar world. They can't accept that China's rise is not temporary. They think China's going to collapse at any moment. And I think all they have left is this military pillar and propaganda. But even propaganda is starting to disintegrate. So, like, this military pillar is what they're doubling down on. But the military pillar itself has been cannibalized by capitalism. It's no longer a productive force. So, even the military pillar, which is the only thing that they've really genuinely invested in, in terms of any sort of productive capacity, doesn't really have the productive capacity anymore. And that's why they're doing it. That's why they're acting that way. I think the rogue state concept, though, makes it seem like the US is completely by itself outside
Yeah.
of the system. And I think that is just misleading. They're trying to find, in Israel, they say the same thing about Israel. Oh, Netanyahu. Israel Netanyahu, they're off on their own planet as if they're not an integrated part of this imperialist system. And it's just the decline of it that is showing this supposed contradiction, But they're just trying to throw somebody under the bus so that they can continue their imperialist system.
Well,
And
it's
that's actually really
yeah,
dangerous.
it's the very nature, right? A lot of
Yeah.
people also say that Israel is controlling the United States. I
Right.
myself personally am one of the few that is saying no, it's the other way around.
No,
But
yeah.
they are more or less the scapegoat for the US imperialism. Not
No,
that they have nothing to do with it. Oh, no, I'm not saying that they're clean. Definitely not.
yeah, no.
But because I always say, they're saying about, okay, it's IPAC giving them money. Well, that's just a kickback, is what I say, because
Yeah.
that money is coming from the United States taxpayers. It's coming from those people that have a 40-hour job that live on the street, right? It's their money that is being
Yeah.
given. So how does Israel have any leverage over the United States? They cannot militarily, they cannot financially, in no way, because if the United States really wanted to change anything, they could just snap with the fingers and Israel cease to exist.
Yeah,
Right?
it's like,
So, yeah, how can it be that Israel is controlling the United States if the United States is not controlling Israel? It's just impossible.
yeah, it's absolutely farcical because like there are two things that come up there. It's like one, what do you think the US would do in that region?
Yeah,
If you really think that Israel's controlling, what do you think the US actually does in the world? These are people that just have not grappled with how horrific US imperialism or imperialism is. They're just not thinking about the amount of genocides that imperialism has actually already committed, And so that's one thing that's very clear. The other thing is I'm always thinking like, oh, someone bribes you. You don't have to accept the money. That's your responsibility. If you
yeah.
accept the money, that is now you are
I
accountable.
have a friend like that too. Yeah. She is a Buddhist, and I'm sorry, my friend. uh, but she also told me, yeah, but they are corrupt when talking about Africa, right? Yeah, but who's corrupting them? Well, they also cannot not take the money. I said, yeah, but then they will be overthrown and their will be taken. Yeah, well, they need better protection, right? They're finding all these kind of solutions. That's really, really weird. Instead of saying, well, maybe we shouldn't do that,
Right. Oh, I
right?
see what you're
And
saying.
like,
I mean, I think in that, like, I
I mean,
see,
yeah,
yeah.
I
But I
mean,
do think,
you can steal from a shop. That's possible, but nobody forces you to do so. You should
right.
not steal, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what your friend is pointing out is really an interesting thing that when we think about colonization, often people are just thinking about like settler colonialism, where it's just like you come in, you take over the country, it's like basically Palestine. But there's also the franchise colonialism where it is like you come in, you take over the system, but you also do require the structure, the people that are already on the top of that system to collaborate with you, But that doesn't mean, therefore, that you have every right to colonize an entire
Yeah,
country, to your point. And it also means that that top layer of that class that's collaborating with the Western powers, I mean, they're traitors, essentially. That doesn't make you less guilty because they're essentially traitors to their
yeah,
people.
definitely, definitely, yeah, yeah.
So, yeah,
And it's also very interesting the moment when people are doing something or when a country is doing something about it to stop it, then they
yeah,
are being demonized, right?
absolutely.
Like China is. has their firewall. China has mechanisms in place that you cannot take over their economy, and everybody is championing. They need to open their market. We need to be able to buy their land. We need to be able to buy their resources, right, and take control of them.
Yeah. I
Uh,
mean, when I interviewed KJ No, I think he put
oh
it in a
yeah,
really he put it in a really good way that I often use now, just saying like every country in the pursuit of sovereignty, which to be fair, to be clear to the audience that may not be aware, most countries are not sovereign in
yeah.
this world because of US imperialism. So
Explain that, because I think that is also very important to understand. Likewise, my country is also not sovereign.
right. I mean, your country, the Netherlands, is part of the US imperialist system. That would be the second ring in the US global North Bloc, the Netherlands. So it's definitely part of that. And I think what people maybe have difficulty understand. Okay, so it's like any group of these are imperialist powers, but they have a hierarchy right now in the global North. The US is the right now the leader of that global North Bloc. And so the Netherlands, if the Netherlands wanted to be sovereign and outside of that bloc, there are key things that they would have to do. The US is going to coerce them not to do that and control them to do that. But KJ No talking about the four sovereignties that are required: digital sovereignty, which he also includes propaganda in that. Energy sovereignty, obviously, is with Iran. We can see the energy situation, and the military sovereignty and political sovereignty. So, how would the Netherlands be sovereign, meaning independent, in those four ways? They would need to untangle from the US and the rest of the imperialist bloc in all those ways. And if we think about like the financialized, like the US being the world's currency, the SWIFT banking system, you think it's so easy to go out of that system, like you can't, first of all, you don't do it overnight, but just in terms of, and then all the digital sovereignty, you have to like remove yourself out of that infrastructure. China is perhaps the only country that, I mean, not the only country, but the only country that's, well, first of all, big enough to really do that in a genuine way. Obviously, we have like countries like Cuba and North Korea
Yeah,
that have been really sanctioned and blockaded by the US and ostracized. But China is like 20% of the population, right? Essentially, or a little bit less. But China has done that perhaps in the most successful way that we have seen. And like you said, like there are many ways in which you would want to discourage a country from doing that, and that is going to be like in terms of digital sovereignty, accusing China of not having human rights, of not having freedom of speech, of not having,
yeah,
and the fact is, why should your technological companies go into China and infiltrate it? We know through many, many means, data mining is one thing that's illegal in China for corporations to do that. So obviously those companies are not going to agree to that, and that's why they're not in China. But also just in terms of like the propaganda that those companies would be spewing to your population, etc. I mean, yeah, to your
yeah.
point, yeah.
And monopolize everything, right? I think very much your internet definitely must be sovereign.
Yes,
Otherwise, you don't
digital
have any
platform.
sovereignty. Like in the Netherlands, the very young generation now speaks half American English instead
Right.
of Dutch. This is how they have been totally colonized, right? Uh,
Yeah.
Even
I mean,
culturally.
and we have to think like, yeah, what does the propaganda arm look like? It's also educational institutions. It's entertainment. Obviously, most people understand that it's entertainment, TV, movie, like Marvel, like the, Zionism, Zionists and Marvel, etc. Um, People understand the entertainment one. Do they understand the educational system is also part of that? That's a very powerful tool for indoctrination, obviously. But also NGOs, like think tanks, all those supposed civil societies that create our moral compass in terms of our society. That's also propaganda as well. So in terms of that, like to actually extricate yourself from that system, it's no easy task.
Yeah, let's move to Asia and see what kind of imperialism or tools of imperialism do we find there. I will name a couple of countries, and can you maybe explain how they are into imperialism or maybe used by imperialists or whatever the mechanisms are? Let's start with Japan.
So Japan is part of the global north. It also has over 50,000 US military troops there. So it's like firmly integrated into the US imperialist system. And obviously now it's being used in this way of through their proposed military expansion. Like you've heard about that, right? They're actually going to be I can't remember is it Article 7 or something, where basically after World War II, because of their fascist nature and their defeat, they signed an agreement to not militarize. But in this past month, they've actually said that within the month they will be allowing the export of military weapons, also the manufacturing of military weapons, etc. This is obviously completely connected to the US, and the US, in their last national strategy plan was national security strategy. They talked about burden sharing of their allies. And as we talked about their military pillar, which is also diminishing because of capitalism, means their productive capacity for military weapons has greatly diminished. So part of their strategy is to get their allies to produce their weapons and their military, the things that they need. And Japan is sort of signing up for that with this new agreement. So Japan is firmly in the global north imperialist bloc. And that's why they talk about Taiwan and
Yeah.
supposed self-defense. First of all, it's
Okay.
incredibly
Let's
delusional.
move to Taiwan then.
Taiwan.
We take the
Yeah.
pain.
I mean, I think we know. Yeah, I think for us, we're in agreement with this. And actually, most countries are already in agreement that Taiwan is part of China. It's a one China, sort of diplomatically ambiguous, but mainly because of the civil war that
Do
just
you
is a
think they are
stalemate.
being used by or for imperialism?
Yes, they are, but with
And how?
well, for starters, they have been really from the offset. Like they were famously, US officials said about Taiwan that's an unsinkable battleship. Like ironically, the US has many of those around the world, as we know. So they're trying to use Taiwan as this unsinkable battleship. It's also like a strategic place for foreign troops to come in and attack China. Like obviously, it's right off the coast. And you can see in terms of the amount of propaganda that is being pushed into Taiwan about this idea that Taiwanese are different ethnicity. I mean, this is completely ridiculous. Just like in terms of pure like facts, ethnically wise, over 90% of the Taiwanese population, which is only a population of 24 million, around 25 million. So over 90% of that population is ethnically Chinese
Yeah.
anyway. Ethnically Han probably
Yeah.
or Chinese. And then there are some indigenous, but even when we look back in history, I mean, we have to remember that China was never really an empire. It was never an empire of extraction. So it it had this sort of relationship with Taiwan that's like hundreds and hundreds of years, not thousands of years, really. And then officially, Taiwan was part of Fujian for about 200 years before the Japanese, and like together with China mainland and Taiwanese people, they fought off the Dutch.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they have this long history of just being part of the same country. And 50 years under Japan colonization, sure, that did happen, but then it was supposed to come back into China, come back into the one China, and then the KMT fled to Taiwan. So, I mean, short story, very long story. And I think for people that want to know more, to go to Chow Collective because they have a really good anti-imperialist timeline on Taiwan on their website, Chow Collective. So yeah, for people to go and look at that, and then they can understand really more the history of Taiwan. But yes, they're absolutely being used because of this ambiguous diplomatic thing of two governments, one country, which is really the arrangement that China would be totally, China mainland would, and even Taiwan were totally fine with, if not for this interference from the US. The interference from the US makes it a lot more precarious to continue this ambiguity.
I think I didn't hear clearly who you mentioned that they need to look up to
Oh, look, if they
or look
want to
forward
know
to.
more about Chow, it's
Chow.
QI, Chow
Chow's
Collective.
Collective. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah,
If they want to look at Chow Collective for that,
yeah.
a really good document on that.
And what about South Korea and North Korea? How have they been suffering of imperialism or complicit in or being used as?
Right.
I think they're pretty, yeah, they're all over the place when it comes to that, right? They're equally a victim as also a
Yeah.
part of the imperialist system. It depends on which part you are.
Yeah,
Can you
exactly.
explain that?
Yeah, so I think we have to think of the Korean War again. It was a genocidal war, the US genocidal war against Korea. And it was kind of like, I guess we could kind of think of it as a stalemate because North Korea is the one that remained free, essentially was able to fight off the US invasion. And South Korea became what is now sort of categorized as a de facto US military colony. It has about almost 30,000 US military troops in Taiwan, South Korea. Taiwan doesn't have that many, but it does have US instilled permanent troops, by the way. Um, but yes, South Korea has almost 30,000 US military troops there. It has military bases there. It has no control over its own military. The US has wartime control. Wartime control of your military essentially means they control your military. And even to the point where using the THAAD missiles, which is the US, the missiles that South Korea supposedly bought from the US, but you know how it is, it's just a leasing situation. The president of South Korea does not have control over that. The military doesn't answer to the president when it comes to this sort of thing. It answers to the US. So it is a de facto US military colony. That's what
Yeah.
South Korea is. And so their ability to maneuver against the US is obviously very, very limited, although the president currently, I think, is very much trying to maneuver as much as he can um, and have stronger ties with China. That is sort of evidenced by his recent visit to China. But there's just not that much that he can really do under those circumstances. So that's South Korea. North Korea is, like we said, the actual free country, the sovereign country in that. I mean, really, they should be one country, right? But they're the sovereign country.
This is going
And
to rage bait so many people.
really, you think so? This is just
Well,
factually historical.
I can see the comments flooding.
Really?
What?
Wow.
North Korea free?
I guess I'm going to get a lot
Yeah.
of hate. I'm going to get a lot of hate. Well, go to Empire Watch and
Explain
continue.
what you mean by that, because I agree. I agree. But
Yeah, I mean,
explain with what you mean by that for the people, because a lot of people will not agree.
yeah, a lot of people won't agree, but we have to think again about the Cold War and the positioning of the anti-communists, the imperialists that supposedly they won. I would say they won. However, we're not out and we're not dead, you know what I mean? But yeah, the US imperialists won the Cold War. Or it's like the Cold War is really still ongoing in many, many
Yeah.
ways. And so North Korea was the communist part of that, the Cold War, the communists on one side, the imperialists on the other side. And that's what, so they actually managed to fight off the imperialists. And everything that they have been accused of has been a reaction to protecting from those imperialists. And this is the thing that really perplexes me because I think you're right that maybe people will be very mad at me saying this, but it's just insane to me. Like, why do you guys hate North Korea so much? Like,
Yeah.
what has North Korea ever done to any of the other countries, like including your own? And even in terms of your accusations of North Korea, again, similar to like China, the all the accusations against North Korea, what they have supposedly done to their own people, but you absolutely cannot think about like the Great Leap Forward in China or the famine that happened in North Korea that resulted in all these deaths. You can't separate that from the fact that it was embargoed, essentially blockaded from the West.
Yeah, that is also what I always trying to express to the people is so you are mad at Kim because there's famine, but you're not mad that we're denying them food,
Exactly.
right?
You know,
It's so ridiculous to even think like that. Why don't we leave them alone?
right.
Just let them do their thing and we do our thing, right? Uh, and yeah, I mean, we are
Yeah.
constantly trying to overthrow them. So militarily, they need to be strong and they need to be a little bit paranoia because
Yeah.
if they let their guards down, then the whole entire Kim family will be gone and executed by imperialists, right?
Yeah.
It is not that they didn't try it before, and that is why things are happening how they are happening. And second, we don't know what's happening there. I mean, I don't have. I'm still reading about it right now, but I'm still stuck in what we did to them because it's so
Huh.
much. It's
Exactly.
that I still not have not come to the part how North Korea in itself is altogether. But
I mean,
definitely we did some really, really bad things to them. And it's just, yeah, it's impossible not to think of that and just blame. We always blame Kim while he's not even the president. And
mhm.
yeah, it's just so weird. And I also talk to people, yeah, and then they will tell me, yeah, we place sanctions on them because they have a bad government. And I'm like, yeah, but what if I would say that you are a bad parent and therefore I just kick your kid?
Yeah, it
Does that
makes
make
no
sense?
sense.
It
It
makes
makes
no
no sense.
sense. Yes.
Yeah,
Right?
because like sanctions are an act of war and they're punitive. They're punitive to the population. They always affect the weakest of the society. I mean,
Yeah.
it makes no sense to be like, oh, I don't like, yeah, exactly like your point. I don't like your leadership, so I'm going to just punish the entire population. Like
Yeah.
that already doesn't make sense.
And I think that we
Um,
also need to look at how was North Korea before and how is it now? Because that's what becomes very, very interesting since we bombed like 80 to 90% of all their buildings. That means that basically all North Koreans were homeless after that Korean War, right? In the 50s.
yeah.
Now you don't have homeless anymore. So how is it if the government is so extremely bad to its people that
Mhm.
nobody is homeless? How come that in the United States, who has the most money and is free to trade with everybody, and you have so many homeless over there? But they are the good guys, and North Korea is supposed to be the bad guys, right? And then we
Irrational.
see the healthcare. Yes, it is not optimal because
They're
they're
sanctioned.
being sanctioned and the economic embargoes. I mean, let's let's just face it. We're denying them everything. Same that we do with Cuba,
Hmm.
right?
Yes,
Cuba
exactly.
has the most doctors. They sent them all over the globe during COVID, right? And yet we are
Yeah.
trying to destroy the lives of the Cuban people. And we can never have anything when you ask the people what did they do wrong to us, nobody ever until this day has said anything like what they did because they can't.
Yeah, I
But we
know.
still allow it to happen. How come we allow that?
Yeah, I
It's
mean, I think that the thing that is really perplexing to me is just the amount of the demonization actually works. Like
yeah,
it really makes no sense at all. And it is coming back to imperialism, it is like what you said, like what we've been talking about, because people just really they don't understand at all what imperialism has done, like what we're responsible for, our countries are responsible for. Because yeah, 20% of the population was killed by the
yeah,
US invasion.
yeah, and in the most heinous ways, and also by South Koreans under the supervision of the U.S. Right? They literally, for people that don't understand, I mean, really vicious. It almost looked like the Japanese in China. They would take families and let them dig their own grave and then shoot them so they fall in, and then let the other one dig another grave besides them, knowing that they're going to be shot. This was done by the South Korean dictatorship under supervision of the United States. The U.S. Army was present when that was happening.
Mhm. Yeah.
People don't understand that, and then they're saying, "Oh, but North Korea is treating its people bad." It, even if they would, it also doesn't give us the right to do extra bad, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't even make sense. Why would
Yeah,
they be purposely starving their population?
yeah.
What
That
possible thing would they gain from that?
well,
Just
we
irrational.
threw some napalm on their farming sites, right? On their
Hundreds
fertile,
of
yeah,
thousands of
yeah.
tons of napalm.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
they could not, and in the land that they could, they were the CIA was bribing the North Koreans with rice because they didn't have food, and what they did was they told them to cut off the oxtail. So the if the or from the cow or whatever it is that they use on the land, right? So because if they don't have the tail, they cannot work the land anymore.
Oh, I didn't
Yeah,
know
so they
about
couldn't
that. It's
sow.
very
Yeah, it was
interesting. Horrible.
extremely vicious,
Wow.
and that is obviously creating a lot of famine or causes for famine, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Horrific.
And that is what we
Yes.
don't we never think about. And why would you blame a government for famine instead of helping them to
Right.
send food,
Like blocking
right?
trade to them and
Yeah,
then saying, "Oh, you're responsible for the death of, it's of your population." It's absolutely, yeah, it's absolutely barbaric.
absolutely. And yeah, well, China has been accused of that too, right?
Exactly.
In the 60s. And then I said, well, there were a couple of other famines before. Why we never speak about those?
Right.
That was in the time that
Exactly.
the British were there, and the English, and or the Germans, and the Japanese, and all who were there. There was constantly famine. Why don't we talk about those
Yeah.
famines?
I mean, it's always intentionally left out that even during Mao, the life expectancy rose quite significantly, So everyone just always talks about how Mao was responsible for killing millions. And it's like, again, it's the circumstance. He's not doing it, the idea that they would phrase it in the West, was this intentional? Why would he do that intentionally?
Yeah.
Is absolutely insane to me. But that's how demonization, what demonization gets you, I think, because you just believe that these people are just evil, insane, psychotic people.
Yeah, exactly, and that's yeah. But they think about it of all the Chinese leaders, right? On Quora, I often see why are the Chinese people still supporting Xi Jinping after he committed so many crimes? And then when you ask what crimes did he commit, there's no answer.
What crimes did
Right? Why, or something like that, right? Or he's so evil to the
yeah,
people. So what is so evil that he did? And I see a lot of Chinese people they're posting all these things like, oh, do you think 100 million lifting 100 million people
yeah.
out of poverty that's evil?
Yeah, I don't. I don't know what he's supposedly done that's evil. Is it
I
the
also don't know.
Uyghur, is it the Uyghur thing that they're trying to say is him? The
Yeah, it,
Uyghur.
it's so weird, right?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, let's go to Philippines because Philippines is also very much. Oh, that's my lady. Very much under imperialism and suffering tremendously because of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
I
Philippines is
believe
a
in the
diff
50s they were actually the rising power in Asia, right? Or like a
well,
model, or they were named like that.
yes.
Yeah,
That's a really good point. And I think that just speaks to the shift in the world that we're seeing now, because part of why the Philippines was considered like at the forefront of art and culture and like really sort of seen as maybe like above other Southeast Asian countries was because of their use of English as well. Like they have a long history of colonization, 450 years under the Spanish and then 100 years under the US. But they are considered now is a de facto US military colony, much like South Korea. They have around 11 US military bases now, resurrected under the current, not just under, well, maybe under this current President Marcos Jr. Bongbong. Um, but yeah, I think the thing that is interesting, like you're saying, because they used to be, I think the rest of Southeast Asia used to kind of look to them as this cultural vanguard. And now you just see what happens when you back the US, right? Because they are actually, I think the only country that is poorer than they are is currently Myanmar. I think. Um, so they're extremely poor. They're extremely underdeveloped. They could have had, for example, high-speed rail there, but the agreement between China and the Philippines fell through. And now that Duterte is being charged at the
in my city.
ICC in your city, exactly, The Hague. Um, but it sort of exposes the weakness of the Philippines because there's no reason why he should have been brought to the ICC. They have their own Supreme Court in the
Yeah.
Philippines. If they wanted to deal with him, they should have dealt with him. The fact that they are doing this in this way just shows how weak the current president is and how under the thumb they are in terms of US.
Yeah, and the Philippines is capable. I spoke with some people from the Philippines, also with an international lawyer. I believe I have a conversation with her when she was in The Hague. Uh, and they are capable because they should first try to convict him in his own country to stand trial, but only if they're not capable, then they will ship it to the ICC. Uh, but they are capable because there were some co-defendants who have already been prosecuted by the
Mm.
Philippines. So that already shows that they are capable. It's not that the country is not capable of doing. So it looks very, very weird
Yeah.
that it happened this way, right?
Yeah, and it is it's a testament to how popular the Duterte family is. I mean, one of the problems with Philippine politics is that they have political dynasties and political families. Like they basically just sort of rotate their families. But Duterte was kind of seen, Rodrigo Duterte was seen as an abnormally. He was a bit of like a cowboy type of Trump figure. That's how we saw him in the West. But essentially, he was just trying to be a little bit more neutral in terms of dealing with China and the US. Obviously, he was painted as this pro-China Trump figure, but
Yeah.
actually, he was much more neutral. You know, like he was really trying to do a non-alignment thing. Although his rhetoric was very, very strong. Like, you know, he called Obama a son of a bitch and a CIA stooge or something. So
Yeah.
he's not the most diplomatic of figures. But he was trying to strengthen ties with China, and but um, he wasn't just like fighting completely off the US. There was still ties between both.
But I
Yeah.
think these things arise, calling the people pro-China or whatever they call him, it's because they don't own their own media, right? Their media is very much infiltrated by U.S. corporate media.
Yeah, in fact, Maria Ressa got the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. Maria Ressa, she's I think, the co-founder, the editor of Rappler, which is a very prominent media outlet in the Philippines, like one of the most famous media outlets, and that is NED funded, so National Endowment of Democracy funded. So, and that's not going to be the only one. I mean, I think the thing with the Philippines too is like there's US backers for every political candidate. So when Marcos Jr. was elected, actually from the population of the Philippines, they were thinking it would maybe be a continuation of Duterte because his vice president at that time was Sara Duterte, this daughter of Rodrigo Duterte. And even though Rodrigo Duterte might have had reservations about Marcos Jr., the fact that his daughter was the VP running on the same ticket really suggested like, oh, maybe, maybe Marcus Jr. will be better than the other US backed candidates. So it's not, people really like in my comments when I cover the Philippines, people are like, oh, the Philippines, they're idiots and they made their own bed. And it's not that simple, as we
Yeah,
said with
it never
Imperial.
is.
Yeah.
What can individuals do against imperialism, even if you live in a country that is exercising imperialism, like maybe the Netherlands or the UK
Yeah.
or the United States. Yeah, and I don't care saying it's the UK too. I'm not going to England anymore, anyways.
It's definitely the UK.
I'm scared. No, I
No, you're
definitely
scared.
no. They invited me to come. I said no, I'm not
Oh,
going.
really?
Yeah, I don't want to be under arrest under terrorist charges, right?
Oh
Because I
my
made a
gosh.
social media post.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I'm in the UK currently, so I
Yeah,
don't see. Um, but
you can disagree.
we yeah, well, yeah, it's different. I think if we're looking at Southeast Asia, the part of the reason why I like continue with my channel is like I just really want people, the populations of Southeast Asia to understand what the historical effects of colonialism and imperialism and the current effects of imperialism and how to sort of navigate between those two because one of our main problems would be like color revolutions, right? Like all these NED-backed NGOs, they come in, they brainwash our populations, supposedly these Gen Z protests, etc. But they're color revolutions. They're US-backed CIA type of revolutions like the Hong Kong protest. So
Yeah,
that's like something that's really important. Like if you're in the
or
global south
Tiananmen
to
Square.
understand, yeah, Tiananmen Square, that where no
Yeah.
one actually died in the Tiananmen Square. But so for us, we really have to understand this. We have to really be able to very rightly understand that if US is coming in with their initiatives, don't trust them. Always like fight for sovereignty and to always like choose that the candidate that is less likely to be influenced by US pressure, etc. Of course, things aren't so simple. But I think that's like absolutely important for us not to fall for this type of US backed color revolution type of rhetoric, right? In the global north. But having said that, okay, just wait, one more thing about Asia. I would say that in a way it is very much more optimistic, even though we're feeling the effects maybe in a more extreme way. Like if you look at the Philippines, the fact that they've aligned with neoliberal policies of the US means that they were the first country to declare national energy emergency. And like genuine people are really suffering. Like the middle class is like not even really leaving their houses, because of the fuel inflation and all those things. So we're definitely feeling the brunt of those things. But actually, in Southeast Asia and Asia in general, because of the proximity with China, because ASEAN is the number one bilateral trading partner with China, there's so many things that are positive and optimistic right now because of the rise of China and what that means for that region. And so, like, it's almost like, yes, it's almost like I'm obsolete, but not really obsolete in terms of the propaganda, fighting against the propaganda, because the population there can see for themselves the effect of what China has achieved. They can go to China and see it for themselves. And that is the most persuasive thing ever. So I think in terms of Asia, I feel more optimistic and hopeful. And it's almost like, you know, the task isn't as big. I mean, obviously, we still want people to understand socialism. We still want some sort of movement building to happen within those countries. But I think the example of China that's so clear will naturally allow people to be curious about their system, curious about how they did it. And so that obstacle isn't as big. In the global north, though, our biggest obstacles, like it's just like a lot of it is this arrogance that we have about being the superior superpower in the world. And it's very hard for us to actually have new ideas that aren't ours, supposedly ours. It's just very hard right now to overcome that sort of superiority complex in terms of looking at systems outside of our system and learning from them. We're not used to that at all. Like, we're just used to the ones that are the thought leaders or whatever. So I think that's a really big thing. But yeah, I think ultimately, I would say for us, we have to get out of the way of the global south. Get out of their way. Stop sabotaging
Yeah.
them. Stop protesting them. You are the enemy. We have to absolutely accept that we are the ones that are causing
Yeah, we
them.
are the enemy. Definitely well said.
Yeah.
Because that's also always what I say. I say we don't need. They're not our enemy. We are their enemy,
No. Yeah.
right? They
They're
never
not the
attacked
enemy.
us. It is the other way around.
They gain nothing from
Yeah.
that. Yeah. So there's that one thing, like we get out of their way. We stop putting our energy into things like that, into demonizing other countries. And I do think like more and more I didn't begin my entire YouTube channel as a socialist. And I would say even then I have a lot of study to do. But socialist systems, Marxist systems are sort of necessary. We do need to be building those mo movements on the ground. But like number one is we cannot be demonizing other countries while we're doing that, you know.
Okay. And for the people, because most of the people are not really educated on the topics. And
Right.
I think that's also by design, because these
Yeah.
things is something that you should be learning in school, right? We don't learn about capitalism, we don't learn about socialism, we don't learn about any economic system other than how we have to work within our system. So we're not aware, we don't have choices, right? Although we can vote, we don't have real choice because we don't have the knowledge. So what is it that you're going to vote for? And that is just on what kind of propaganda suits you more.
Mm.
What are the top three books that you would
Oh.
recommend so people can, after this, dive into it and order a copy and enlighten themselves?
Um, you know what? Oh gosh, I don't, yeah. So I'm reading this really good book, but I don't know if it's that accessible. But I'm reading this right now, Unequal Exchange, by Torkel Lawson. And I'm gonna try to get him on Global Majority for Peace. I'm planning to interview him at some point. It's actually really good on how imperialism and colonialism, um, and the world system works. I mean, obviously, it's not the most accessible of books. Okay, so I really understand that. But this book is more accessible on China. Carlos Martinez, The East is Still Red. This is just a really good intro to all the issues that come up around China. And it does cover, like it has a chapter on the history as well and Mao and the um, a few paragraphs on the Great Leap Forward. It's not really about the historical thing. It's more about like, although it has that chapter, but it talks about like all the, it's really, really good because it talks about like all the accusations against China. So like that China is imperialist, that there's a Uyghur genocide, etc. It just like covers that really well. And what else would I sort of suggest? I mean, I do also, I'm also reading this, Western Marxism. Um, and so this is, I think, really important because there's actually, so Gabriel Rockhill has a new book, Who Paid the Pipers, of Western Marxism. I don't know if you've read that book. Like,
I
that's
have
on
not.
my reading list. It actually is very
I've actually
controversial.
read none of the books that you just recommended,
Oh,
so I
really?
just placing them on my list right now.
Oh, cool. Like I think they're really good. So th he actually so he has this new book called Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, which I really want to read because it again talks about this Western Marxist, Eastern Marxist issue that we're having. And I think like that's why I like this book too, because Western Marxists are essentially imperialists. They're pretending to be socialists. And so I think
A lot
like,
of
yeah,
times, yeah.
right? Like because they denigrate Eastern socialist projects. Like they will denigrate China. And
Yeah.
so that's why I'm saying, like, if you're a socialist and you're trying to make change in your country and you're denigrating any of the countries that are actually part of that process of building those projects, you're not going to win. You're not going to be able to build anything because you have no pragmatic viewpoint,
I
right?
actually was reading this
Oh,
book, and
right. Yes,
was
I had
just
to.
yesterday when I was sitting in the train and read it was exactly what you just said was in this
Oh,
book.
really?
Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
my God, I have to read
Yeah.
that book then.
This book is really, really great. It is about the fight
Yeah.
against what all the things what they do against people who want to be communist or socialist, and
Right.
very interesting to read how these things are going.
Yeah, yes, I've heard that that is a seminal book to read. So I also recommend that book, having not yet read it, and I recommend it to myself.
uh,
Yeah.
all right, I think that is about it for this time. If you have more to say,
Oh my gosh, no, but
because
I'm
it's
looking
I
forward
think it's
to,
already a lot for people to take in, right? It's a very, yeah.
yeah,
Although it is said that imperialism has been around for hundreds of years, the topic is not well known as it
no,
should, right?
no. Yeah,
Uh,
it's not well known. And I think maybe to just end with the most important part of our conversation is maybe like just recognizing the structure of imperialism that is
yeah,
in existence now, because we do need to dismantle it. And we're actually in the moment of time where that actually looks possible. And I think this is the first time in hundreds of years where we could actually say that. And it is part of the rise of China that's allowing that to happen.
yeah, and it also, especially for the western part of Europe, who are so anti-immigration and are so much against refugees, then definitely you should be against imperialism because that is literally the source of refugees. Right? Refugees do not become refugees. For my Dutch fellows, I love you, but they do not come here to find a better life. They're not risking their lives to come over here because they heard that it was such a wonderful country. Because most of you are complaining about this nation as well, right? They are coming here because we destroyed their nations and we made their place unlivable for them. That is why they come here to, get a better life. They're forced to. And then they come here and then we are cursing them out and blaming them for everything what is wrong in our country. But essentially, we are the source of their unhappiness and our unhappiness because of that, right? So I think, I hope, yeah, maybe you agree or
Yes,
disagree.
I absolutely agree. Like we
Yeah.
keep on destroying other people's countries that they need to
Yeah.
go somewhere. So yeah, I agree with that. But it's a new world coming, so thank you.
Yeah. I hope I can see it in my life.
I
The
think
big
we
change.
will. I think we will.
Yeah. I just want to thank you for enlightening everybody, and yeah.
Hope it was
Also,
coherent.
where can they find you? That's very important. I will list everything also in the description.
Okay,
But
cool. Thank you.
maybe if you can tell them where they can find you.
So I have a YouTube channel called Empire Watch. So you just go at Empire Watch on YouTube. And also, I'm on social media as Ileana C for peace, but it's not, it's four as in FOR peace. Ileana C for peace.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I'm trying to be better at social media. I'm like taking some like inspiration from you.
From me.
You're great
I'm
at
not, no, I'm not. I'm really horrible.
it.
I'm really horrible. Don't take it from me. Take from somebody who got hundreds of thousands of people following, right? All right.
No,
I
but I
really want
think,
to
yeah.
thank you for this
Thank
conversation.
you. Thank you for this
Yes.
conversation. Thank you. And see you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.